You're listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I think it's always important in the spiritual life to root ourselves in a proper understanding of who we are and how we're relating to our God. And from one side, what we've got to do is see the essential goodness about ourselves. It's true that we are people of temptation, and it's true that we can blow it and that we are sinful creatures and we have to admit it. But there's a whole other side to our life, the positive side. We're created by God.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Father Roland Calvert, Associate Pastor at Pius X Parish in Toledo. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of spirituality and developing potential. Here's Father Bacik.
Roland, I find it always interesting when we're in discussion together. I notice one thing, that when we're in a group and we begin to talk, and maybe I've given a presentation and you respond, people always listen to you. I know I've noticed that over the years, that people always feel that you have something to say, and you say it so well. So that's why you're one of my favorite guests on this program and why you're on so often, I guess. I keep looking for that kind of feedback. Yes. And I think that I will just let you take over this whole program, therefore, today.
Thank you, John. Yeah.
Well, maybe I'm supposed to do my job, so I better at least initiate the topic, right?
Yes.
And begin that. And I guess that I'm on the question here really of the positive ways that we try to grow in the spiritual life. From one perspective, it would be seeing the Lenten season in a very positive way as a time of constructive activity in order to build ourselves up, of trying to, in one way, or for people who aren't into Lenten talk so much, for just saying, how are they going to achieve growth in their lives by positive kinds of means. Okay. Now, it's easy to approach Lent, I suppose, from a negative side and say, well, I've got to give up things and there's renunciation and all that. But I really want to look at the other side of it, the more positive side of self-growth. And maybe we got to think practically about how we would go about that and so on.
Yeah, it is very easy during Lent or any other time of the year to emphasize the negative. That almost leaps the mind right away, giving up food, giving up money for almsgiving or whatever. But I also believe that the more positive things are needed. You have to take an inventory and see who you are at this given moment in your life and what the needs are and what can I do in a positive way. I'm not putting down the negative because I think we do need to fast. Mm-hmm. We do need all those other practices. But we also need to do positive things. I go to movies myself. My Lenten
your Lenten penance?
That's my Lenten resolution.
Well, I can think of some movies that I think that would fit in with the traditional Lenten ideas.
Well, I try to pick the good ones. Actually, during Lent, this is going to sound strange, and maybe I am strange, but I have seen Gandhi twice, and I have seen the movie Tootsie. Now, they are about as different as you can get, but both of those spoke in different ways to rather deep themes about being human. And I honestly believe that is part of Lent, to think about those things and live.
Well, I consider that to be an absolutely original contribution to the idea of Lenten penances. I have never before heard anyone say their Lenten penance was to go to movies. But that one can see that, and it fits in. I think it's always important in the spiritual life to root ourselves in a proper understanding of who we are and how we're relating to our God. And from one side, what we've got to do is see the essential goodness about ourselves. It's true that we are people of temptation, and it's true that we can blow it and that we are sinful creatures and we have to admit it. But there's a whole other side to our life, the positive side. We're created by God. What's that poster they have that God doesn't make junk?
Yes.
We're creatures of God. When God at the beginning created the world, He looked out and this is good. These are things are good that He makes. And then what do we read in Genesis when He makes human beings? He says, and they're very good. Yes. He looks down at this marvelous creation. So I think it's important for us to sense that positive side of who we are. There are impulses to good that arise in our hearts. We find that beauty allures us in certain ways. We respond to truth. There's a search for truth, and when we hear it, we like that, or we are refreshed by it. And so we are the people who are called upon to be in touch with our talents, our gifts. God has given us so much. What do the psychologists often say? Well, we only use 10% of our talent. I don't know where they get that or anything, but you do have the sense that many of us, we don't develop all of our potential. There's so much more that we could do. There's a way in which we do have to reach for the stars, or think in idealistic ways of what we could be and what we could become. And that's not just pie in the sky, because it's probably true that for all of us there are good things inside of us. Either we don't recognize them, or we haven't developed them, or we don't use them for the benefit of the larger community. So I think a healthy anthropology here, or a good understanding of who we are, really would put us in touch of a positive side to ourselves, of talents that need developing, gifts that we could expend for the benefit of the larger world. And so part of Lent, therefore, would seem to me to be in touch with that. Part of spiritual growth is to identify those gifts, talents, and be able to use them constructively in some way.
I have no doubt that we are in low gear a good part of our lives, and that we could go much more high gear to help others to live more passionately. You know, we're dead in some ways, in the bad sense of that word. We're not fully alive. Is it Irenaeus that the glory of God is man fully alive?
Or as we like to say in today's society, the glory of God is the human person,
the
fully
human person,
alive.
right?
Roland, yes.
Irenaeus was not a feminist.
Yes.
Yeah. What you said earlier also occurred to me, that in an older spirituality, the three enemies, I remember being taught this in the 50s and the 40s, the three enemies were the world and the flesh and the devil. And it was that very negative approach, so that you should fear the world. And yet that is contrary to Genesis, which clearly says, as you pointed out, that God made the world and it's good and it's beautiful. Now there is a force of evil in the world, and it would be foolish to deny that. But essentially the world is God's creation. It's a glorious, wondrous, beautiful thing. And human beings the same way.
Well, part of the strength, I think, of our Catholic heritage is this idea that we are divinized by God's grace, that we become temples of the Holy Spirit, that we have an essential goodness about us that is at the very core of our being, that God lives within us. Augustine liked to say that God was closer to us than we are to ourselves.
Yes.
And so that we are really not, in our viewpoint and out of our own tradition, our Catholic heritage, we are not really depraved individuals who need to build fences around ourselves and all kind of tight rules and laws to make sure that our impulses are not out of control.
Yeah.
But we really believe that we are changed, transformed by God's gift of love, that there's an essential goodness about us. God's Spirit is intertwined in our psyche, our consciousness, our body, our very being. And that creates a very different situation, therefore. It suggests that full Christian life is not simply a matter of renouncing, of keeping tight, rigid controls upon ourselves, but that in a way we can go with the flow, that we can take the darker side and transform it, that the mysterious things that are in the shadows, the demons as I like to call them, when brought into the light of day are simply not as powerful as we once thought. That's what I get out of the miracles of Jesus. Jesus works miracles. He casts out the demons. And those miracles of Jesus always speak to me of saying, hey, the good is more powerful than the evil. The angels can defeat the devils. Jesus Christ, His grace, His power that's at work in the whole world really is stronger than any of the evil forces we find either in our own hearts or in institutions. And that's really one reason I see the gospel as being indeed good news for us, because it gives us a very positive sense of who we are.
Sure. Well, the patron of my religious congregation, the Oblates, is St. Francis de Sales, and he lived in the Counter-Reformation era, and John Calvin was very active at that time. The Protestant Reformer teaching, I think the essence of his teaching was that man is depraved, is rotten.
But just to catch a minute, I don't know that that's the essence of his teaching. I think we got to be fair to John Calvin here.
Yeah.
I think the essence of Calvin's teaching really was the sovereignty of God, the transcendence of God. He had a marvelous sense that God's in charge of this world and so on. And I think that sovereignty of God and it played off against what he saw about the depravity and evil in life, led him to that other conclusion. I didn't want to interrupt your thought, but I think that fairness there dictates, because that is so much a part of our culture. The Calvinistic ethic really dominates in the United States. It has from our very beginning, and I think only in a way now are we moving beyond that. So it's, I think, important to be somewhat careful about what it is that is the dominant ethic in our country. And I believe that the key for Calvin really was the sovereignty of God. But there's no doubt he wrote that. He said it. Human nature is essentially depraved, and it is very often the Puritans who put those stringent laws on the books. The people who had to be against gambling, against dancing, against contraception. Interestingly enough, they're the ones who put those laws on the books and so on. So anyway, I'm off and running there, and didn't want to interrupt your point.
But that would be fair, so let me put that. It's not necessarily the essence. But man sure didn't come out, or human beings, very well under Calvin's theology. And the opposite of that would be somebody like Pelagius, who I think even more incredibly said that human beings are totally good. Our nature has no capacity for evil or sin. And then St. Francis de Sales, in the middle of those two positions, would come along and emphasize the goodness. We are children of God. That poster you mentioned, God made me, and God don't make no junk. Not grammatical, but absolutely true. And Francis used the analogy, which I think is rather good, that our soul is like a garden, and that there are some weeds in it, and we have to do some weeding, but that in that garden there are flowers, and we pull the weeds out so that the flowers can grow. And it is essentially a beautiful creation. And we ought to think of ourselves as beautiful, coming from God.
What were the dates of St. Francis, your founder?
1567 born, died in 1622.
So he's in part of what we know as the Counter-Reformation period. Was he explicitly reacting against some of the Calvinistic teaching in writing that way?
Well, St. Francis de Sales was the Bishop of Geneva, the Catholic bishop, and of course at that time Calvin and his Bacik, I think, was his successor, had taken over Geneva. So St. Francis de Sales could not go into his own diocese without endangering his life. He did that quite often in disguise, but he was directly countering Calvinism.
Yes. Well, it's interesting, I think, in the United States today, whatever people's religious background, I think there is the cultural sense that we should be self-actualizing people. I think that many are thinking that the renunciation theme has been overdone, and that there's been too much talk of giving up and mortification. And I believe there's many people, the culture as a whole, who think, no, I don't want to do that. And we need to actualize myself. I got to develop my potential and talents. And in my mind, there's something good about that. It can get out of control. It can become do your own thing. It can become a hedonism and a lack of responsibility to others, and really no charity directed to the larger community. But keeping it in proper bounds, or maybe better put into a proper context of relationship and responsibility, I think that self-actualizing ideal is a healthy one, and really is in accord in a way with the gospel understanding of things, and especially parts of our Catholic heritage.
Well, just before I came here today, I watched an interview on the Tom Cottle show on TV this morning with Beverly Sills, the director of the New York City Opera, a Jewish woman, but a religious and one of those fully alive people, who is the ideal that I think we ought to aim at. And in her own life, talking about mortification and the negative kinds of things, she talked a lot about her two children. One, the girl born deaf, not able to hear her own mother, one of the greatest opera singers who ever performed. And even worse, the son who was born to her, who was autistic and totally unable for a lifetime to function very well. And she talked about those children in her lives and the mortification she had to go through. At one time, she totally gave up. She said that her mother came into their home and literally took over and brought the source of energy and said, let's get back and start dealing with this. But she did deal with that, and she certainly didn't choose it, but she dealt with that great pain in her life and somehow has transformed it into her art. She herself says that about 1966, I think it was, after the trauma of dealing with those two children, her own art suddenly began to mature. And she went back to the New York City Opera. The specific opera was by Handel, Julius Caesar. And everybody knew that something had happened. There was a deepening of her humanity. And, of course, it went from there, just soared. She's a wonderful human being and a very great artist.
I would think that we see that about great people, that very often their greatness comes precisely out of their conflict in life and their ability to rise above the evil forces or to transform the darkness or the cross in their life. It's the great paradox, again, that we see modeled in Jesus Christ, who in his very death becomes the redeeming person, whose very obedience leads him to a fuller life. And we do see that exemplified. I mean, I think of Kierkegaard. He had a bad relationship, or it broke up, and it spun him into a tremendous outpouring of writings over a period of time. We think of people in the resistance during the Nazi occupations who rose above Camus and the people who respond to crisis in that way. So many of the great people, I think of Martin Luther King and the way he went through difficulties in his own life and violence perpetrated on him, and his response is, no one will ever make me be violent. Yes. No one will ever pull me down to that level. And it made him all the more committed to nonviolence and to working for the movement. And we see it in great people, but I think we see it in ordinary people who don't get the headlines in the paper as well. I must say I see that in my own parents. I had a younger brother, 6 years younger than myself, who was born RH factor at birth. His brain was really mostly destroyed. He really could function not humanly at all throughout his life. And I saw that the way my parents dealt with that and the way they rose above it in a way, in which it brought out surely difficult times, a lot of cross, a lot of suffering, but also what impressed me is great dedication and great compassion and a really Christian spirit. I really haven't reflected on that so much to this moment, but I think that's probably a great shaping influence in my own life, much more so than maybe I've ever admitted or seen, to see my parents deal with this child that could not function at all, my brother David. And I'm sure that something, if there's compassion in my own heart, somehow it's connected in with the way they did that. No headlines with that,
Sure.
And but I think they work out their sanctity in that way. I guess it makes me very proud of my parents, the way they did that. And I'm sure everybody probably can think of a friend, a relative, a loved one who has somehow risen above, transformed a dark experience, and therefore become a more fully alive person as a result.
Sure. Different religious traditions would express that in different ways, but for a Christian it is the cross. It's going through Good Friday that you arrive at Easter Sunday, and the paradox of bringing the fullness of life out of dying. And there's a theory, I don't know who originated it, but it's always appealed to me, that explains our lives as being a series of deaths and resurrection. At every stage, Erickson writes on identity and all that kind of thing. Well, it's really a kind of dying at each stage, being born. 9 months in a certain mode of existence, and then suddenly the traumatic thing we call birth, but it's really death to what you've had. And you go through all the stages of going to school, adolescence, early adulthood, midolescence, and old age, and finally what we really call death in its truest meaning, the physical act of death. But for a Christian, it's simply a beginning again, and a new mode of existence. And I think all through your life, you're rehearsing in a way for that final death. You die in a lot of different ways. And to get the strength, as your parents did, to bring life out of that death, that is very beautiful to behold.
Yes, it is, and inspiring. And I think it's good for us to be on alert to the examples around us of people who have tapped a deeper resource in dealing with life, who've responded in surprising ways, and maybe try to be in touch with that in our own lives as well. No, Roland, we're talking here really about a positive approach to Lent and a positive approach to the spiritual life, where we're trying to tap talents and be in touch with surprising gifts that we ascribe to the Spirit and say that they are God's work within us. And I think that maybe part of our spiritual growth has to be to foster that kind of thing. I wonder if we couldn't try to think for a while of how one might do that. I can think of one, perhaps reading Scripture during Lent or as part of one's regular spiritual life, and thereby cultivating an awareness of Scripture or a love of that kind of thing.
Sure.
I could imagine people in conversation trying to be very in touch with what contribution they could make, of trying to upgrade the conversation, or being in a group and being very afraid to say something, but forcing oneself to go out and to do that. I can think of one of people just smiling at others as they walk down the street, or saying hello to people they know, or going across the church during a greeting of peace to say something to the person, or people walking on campus and just saying hello to others.
Sure.
In other words, that seems like a simple talent, but some people are very good at smiling. Some people are very good at listening.
Yes.
And just by being an extra good listener during the Lenten season could be a great kind of penance to do.
I was just with somebody recently whose smile literally radiated, and once it just did something marvelous to your own sense of well-being. I think it's those ordinary things that we have to work on. If we wait to do extraordinary things and liberate a country like Gandhi, or to have burning bushes like Moses or whatever, that's foolish. What we're called to are the ordinary things. And St. Francis de Sales, again, I have to speak a lot about him because he is the source of a lot of my spirituality, but he emphasizes very much that it is the ordinary that we try to do extraordinarily well. That's the key to living Christianity more passionately. And those positive things are everywhere if we look. If we got rid of the blinders we put on, we'll see people who are hurting, who need attention, who... I remember in the New York Times about I think it's 10 years ago, but it stuck in my mind, a strange story of rabbits near LaGuardia Airport, if I remember. It may have been Kennedy, I think LaGuardia. And they live right where the planes come down on the runway. And this guy, I guess a scientist, got so fascinated, he said, how do they do it? And so he got some of the rabbits and he did tests on them, and he found out that they were all deaf. And that generation after generation, they would be born deaf, and they just adapted to that situation. And the comparison that comes to mind is that we also are very much like that. We do not hear what we don't want to. We don't see what we don't want to. And maybe just to open our eyes and ears and see people who need ministry.
Right, and not just the people out who need the ministry, but to be able to see what the gifts we have within ourselves,
Sure.
To know that what those talents are. I think that very often the culture says there's only certain kinds of talents that are worthwhile, to be logical, rational, successful economically, move up the ladder, know how to manipulate and control. Those are celebrated, but aren't there all kinds of other gifts that maybe people have that they could be in touch with? Compassion towards people who are hurting, sensitivity to the needs of others. Some people can walk in a room and know the people who are feeling shy or awkward. They just have a sense of that, and maybe they could be the ones who would go over and say hello to them and make them feel a little more welcome. And think of the great gifts and talents that so many mothers possess and actually exercise in their household, and maybe they don't think of that as being part of what they bring to it, but great budgetary skills or great psychological skills in dealing with the individuals that they're trying to raise and so on. So that maybe there's many other talents that we have that sort of get hidden and we're not in touch with, and therefore we say, well, I don't have any contribution to make.
Sure. The rewards will also be more smaller and more ordinary, but I'm still thinking of Beverly Sills because that interview made such an impression. And she talked about her autistic son these days who is in a home because he needs constant attention, but she goes regularly. And she says one of the most beautiful moments in her lives, and it only happens infrequently, is he's a grown man now. He's well over 6 foot tall. And as they walk down the path, or at some point, he says occasionally he will put his arm on her shoulder. And it communicates for just a few seconds. She doesn't know what's going on in his mind. She doesn't know exactly what he's thinking about. But she says she knows that that's an act of love. And that somehow it's saying, you are my mother, and I relate to you. And she says those moments are so beautiful that they make up for everything else.
A marvelous example of being attuned to the positive, isn't it,
yes.
that goes on in our world.
Yeah.
That certainly would be part of what we want to cultivate in the whole spiritual life, to be aware. That's one way maybe of thinking of what one would try to accomplish during Lent, is to become more aware. You've really emphasized beautifully that idea of being aware of the people around us and the needs around us and so on. And that surely could be a part of it, trying to increase my sensitivity,
Yes.
trying to make sure that other people feel important when I'm around, and not trying to impress other people, but to make sure that they know their own dignity and worth and their own sense of making a contribution. I think that is the priest's job, to orchestrate the talents of the community, to bring out the best in in the people around us. And also, I think then that's that idea of knowing what I can contribute. What we've been emphasizing is that we're good, made by God, an essential beauty within us, talents and gifts that maybe we have only partially tapped. And I've got to get in touch with those and try to develop more of that potential. And that becomes my real gift and my real offering to the great God who's put those talents within me.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Father Roland Calvert, associate pastor at Pius X Parish in Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was spirituality and developing potential. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.